The first talk is called Supercell's Tale of Two Cities, and the objective of this talk from Giovanni and I will be around what we see are divergent performance outcomes in the implementation of Battle Pass, and we thought it was especially instructive to take a look at Supercell's implementation in two of their games. I will be starting the presentation and presenting the first half, and then the second half will be presented by Giovanni, and I'll go ahead and hand that over to Giovanni then. And in terms of the agenda, start first by talking about the origins of Battle Pass, popularized by Fortnite, although originally developed in Dota. We'll talk about the tale of two cities, and basically what we're seeing are different outcomes in terms of the performance in Clash of Clans versus Clash Royale. Then we're going to try to hypothesize some of the key reasons of the drivers for why we believe there are different performance in terms of the implementation of Battle Pass in different games. And we'll try to generalize some of those learnings as we try to apply Battle Pass in games in the future. And so what we've seen since the introduction of Battle Pass over the past few years has been, this has become a very popular tool for monetization, and as Alex and Jeff will talk about, for engagement. But as I mentioned before, when we look, especially when we look at Supercell, we've seen what we believe are very strong results in Clash of Clans. But when we look at Clash Royale, we've seen that Clash Royale revenue has declined, and that the introduction of Battle Pass has not really helped to offset that decline as it has in Clash of Clans. And so hence what we call the tale of two cities. And so again, the objective of what we're trying to do in this talk today is really try to understand what's going on, that, why do we think that there are different outcomes in those two games? And then again, to try and extrapolate the learnings. And what we saw when the Battle Pass was popularized by Fortnite, when it was launched in season 2 Battle Pass in December 2017, is that we saw three primary benefits of Battle Pass when it was introduced in Fortnite. And the first was the ability to really monetize fair-to-play gameplay, right? And so we had a shooter game, where you don't have progression, you don't have like stateful outcomes. And so the ability to not only monetize fair-to-play, but to help monetize cosmetics was one of the biggest benefits of this Battle Pass system in Fortnite. And it also helped drive broader conversion. And it did that by really improving engagement in terms of providing like a system and a vehicle for providing visual progression in a lot of short and medium term objectives in terms of like quest objectives and things like that, that also gave people things to do and drove that additional engagement. And the third outcome of this, the third benefit, was that it therefore added a meta layer to games that were basically very core loop heavy, right? You've got very gameplay focused games, and then it added the quest system, the objectives, and basically a vehicle to deliver this kind of meta systems layer as well. So when we look at the adoption of Battle Pass, this is a chart by Game Refinery, but what we've seen is that, as mentioned before, that in terms of a lot of the top grossing games, that the adoption of Battle Pass has been on the upswing, and we've seen many companies try and implement Battle Pass in their games. Now, again, despite the fact that a lot of games have tried to implement Battle Pass, unfortunately, what we have seen, though, is we have seen these divergent outcomes in terms of performance. And when we look specifically at the two Supercell games in particular that adopted Battle Pass early, we look at Clash of Clans and we look at Clash Royale. And you can see here that when Battle Pass launched in Clash Royale, it did seem to have a pretty significant revenue boost to the game. Whereas in Clash Royale, we saw that revenue was declining, that there was a little bit of a boost, but then a further decline. And so the question that we want to ask, and that what Giovanni will be diving into in more depth in the next few slides, is why did Battle Pass perform so differently in both of these two games? And just to kind of dig a little bit deeper, what we see is that, and I hope you guys can see this at home, but when we do a year-over-year comparison in terms of the revenue impact, we see that overall, when we compare the period after the introduction of Battle Pass and Clash of Clans, we see that there was a pretty significant increase in terms of net revenue after Battle Pass. And even if we exclude the December 19th update, which was a fairly significant update, we see that just trying to isolate it more to the impact of Battle Pass, that there was still a very significant impact on revenue. But with Clash Royale, revenue continued to decline, as mentioned before. Now, one point of emphasis, however, I just want to make it clear that we can't just look at revenue and be definitive in terms of the impact of Battle Pass, right? So, and what I mean by that is that the potential impact of Battle Pass could be, if we look at these two curves, and this is basically ARPU over time, that Battle Pass could potentially have a lower term, have a kind of depressionary effect on monetization earlier, but might catch up over time. So just by looking at revenue, while we believe that Clash Royale Battle Pass has a net negative impact, we can't definitively say unless we were to actually see the actual ARPU characteristics of after the implementation of Battle Pass in the game. But I believe it's the case that it has a net negative impact, but it's not definitively clear. And with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to Giovanni.
Great. Okay. So thanks, Joe. Before going deep into Battle Pass performance on Clash Royale versus Clash of Clans, I think it's useful to step back a little bit and recap in very simple terms what Battle Pass mechanics are, what the benefits are, and what the requirements to make it work effectively are. So again, very, very simply, mechanics, you all know this, but players make a small upfront payment, and in exchange for that, they have the ability to unlock higher rewards over time if they're able to engage more than they would have otherwise. And what this means is that basically Battle Pass accelerates players' progression. That's the main point from the left-hand side. The benefits, Joe talked about them with regards to Fortnite. Here, I wanna make them a little bit more generic and say, look, if you do it well, Battle Pass should be able to drive conversion, meaning broaden the player base, should be able to drive regularity, meaning that your DAU WOW ratio should be getting closer to 1, hopefully, and ideally also drive engagement in terms of session length and in terms of focusing on specific features or game modes that otherwise players wouldn't have not touched. The requirement is basically, you have to have enough stuff for players to want to chase. And that is the basic requirement because, as we said on the left-hand side, you are accelerating players' progression. So you have to have enough that players want. And that enough that players want could be either economic or non-economic. If it's economic, it means that you have to have a deep and scalable economy. And if it's not economic, it means that you have to have meaningful vanity and perks that players want to chase. Okay, so basically, let's talk about what it means to have a deep economy, a scalable economy, or non-economic rewards that players want. In very simple terms, does the economy have enough desirable chase items that players that can sustain a faster rate of progression for players over time? Is the economy scalable? Can you add, can you expand the list of what players want over time? And then the non-economic rewards are basically, is vanity relevant in this game, in this specific game? And are there enough perks that players consider valuable? Not every game by design will have space for either vanity and or perks. One way in which I think about this is in very simple terms. It's basically a physics problem. If you think about it, the depth of the economy is the size of a bucket full of water, right? The rate of progression is how much water gets out on a regular basis. The scalability of the economy is, your ability to turn on the faucet up top to continue refilling that bucket. And basically, the games that I've seen perform the best are those that are able to generate a never-ending desire to progress, meaning you keep the bucket half full or full enough to cater to the excitement level of your players. When the bucket gets empty, players have beaten it and you don't want to get there, basically. Okay, with that framework in mind, let's look at the two Supercell games and see how they stack up against these three dimensions that we've talked about: depth of the economy, scalability, and non-economic rewards. This framework page is basically a summary of what we were going to be talking about in the next few pages. So here, I'll briefly glance over these points, and then there will be basically a page for each bucket. So in case you have questions, hold on until we get to that page, and then we can talk through them. One more thing I wanted to say is that, of course, the first 2 points are very economy driven. They're basically, again, scalability and size of the economy, that have nothing to do with Battle Pass itself. And the last point is basically how much Battle Pass offers in terms of non-economic stuff. One more general point before diving deep here. If you guys haven't seen it, there's a pretty great talk from Eino Joas, the lead designer on Clash of Clans, who basically talks about the introduction of Battle Pass. And he talks about how before doing that, they had to fix a bunch of things in their economy. So if you look at that presentation or that YouTube video with these concepts in mind, you're going to be able to frame it a little bit more. Great. So let's look at the first one, depth of the economy. So basically, the main point that I'm trying to make here is that the economy of Clash Royale is shallower than that of Clash of Clans. And that is true for a variety of, or for 3 reasons at least. The first one is that the player's desire to collect cards is limited by their ability to use those cards in game, because the game is so punishingly hard, and that's why we all love it. But because the game is so hard, and it takes months to master using each card, you know, if a card doesn't fit in the 8 ones that you have in your deck, because I'm assuming that most players play with 1 or 2 decks because it's so hard, you know, you really don't really care about getting additional cards, or you care less. In contrast, Clash of Clans, if you look at the progression, lots of the progression is not just tied to attack strategies. There's also a big component of upgrading your village. So all of the buildings, all of the heroes too, that are used in offense and defense by basically everybody. So at least half of what you upgrade in Clash of Clans are things that are common to all players. Whereas in Clash Royale, basically it's those 8 cards, and or if you're a master, 2 or 3 decks total. Another point is that you know, Clash Royale has somehow not been able to generate enough incentives for players to collect broad. So beyond that specific deck, you know, they've tried to come up with new game modes like Touchdown, or they introduced Clan Wars, but somehow they were not as effective in compelling players to collect just as much as Clash of Clans did. Speaking of Clash of Clans, instead, basically the end game for most players is the social component, and Clan War Leagues is basically what it comes down to. And the ability to, you know, play with your clans, your clan, and lift your clan up and fight against other clans. And the incentive there is basically to upgrade everything that you can as fast as you can, because that way your clan will be stronger. And so again, very strong incentive to progress. Last point on Clash Royale is not only you know, their economy is smaller than that of Clash of Clans, but they also have diluted it by over time introducing more and more sales, and by making the more valuable cards like legendaries be more easily accessible. Again, more on this later. So that was for the depth part. On the scalability part, I think here is where we have even more problems for Clash Royale. So basically, Clash Royale has hard card caps. When you reach level 13, all your cards, and no matter what type they are, common, rare, epic, or legendary, they basically max out. And you know, that's great, but at the same time, you know, because you reach a max level, it feels good. But because the game is so hard to play, you know, once you get to a reasonable level of those cards, you're basically done. Whereas Clash of Clans instead does what I call a moving goalpost. every few months with a new town hall, or even without a new town hall, they basically raise all of the caps of everything: buildings, troops, spells, heroes. And effectively that means that your progression doesn't stop at level 13 like it does with Clash Royale. It just keeps going. Back to Clash Royale. So new cards, I think, have been less impactful than they could have been. And this is because of how difficult it is to design a new card for Clash Royale that is meaningful. Again, we can go into more depth on this later, but basically, once you have Zap and Log, I don't think you need that many more cheap spells. And you only have 8 slots in your deck. So, because Clash Royale has chosen to unlike other developers, to basically make sure that every card has a unique, narrow purpose, as opposed to trumping power with more cards, like basically every other game does, that limits them. So on one hand, I am applauding their effort to come up with a very pure game, and on the other, I'm saying, well, that has been a very expensive choice for them. Clash of Clans has instead been able to scale the economy not only by adding levels to their cards, but they've also introduced consumables very effectively in their game. And we'll talk in depth about these, but basically they solved many pain points in the economy, and these consumables became valuable chase items for events, for Battle Pass itself, and for offers, and that's awesome. And also, consumables can be easily drained from the economy, so that's a very easy way to scale up your economy. Lastly, on Clash Royale, there really isn't much else to spend on, which is a direct contrast with the consumables that Clans was able to add. Effectively, once you have the cards that you need, and you may spend some gems on a couple of emotes if you want that specific one, you may spend a couple of gems on challenges, but that's really it. Okay, so basically we've painted a picture where Clash Royale has not only a smaller economy, but a less scalable economy. Now let's look at Battle Pass specific points, and so non-economic rewards. My point here is that both games have introduced vanity that I'm assuming many players can find exciting. Clash Royale has tower skins and emotes, and Clash of Clans has 1 skin per hero per Battle Pass. And so I think here they're pretty much doing the same kind of job. I think where Clash of Clans performs better is they've stacked their Battle Pass with lots of meaningful perks. And these perks are similar to the consumables in that they're not something that players would really spend a lot of money on, but they're very valuable. For example, the one gem donation, all of the research boost, and all the building boost, those are amazing. And they're worth buying the Battle Pass, even if you don't make it to the very end. And by themselves can make your experience from a quality of life standpoint so much better that they may be just as relevant as the economic gains that you can get. And also from a share of the non-economic over total Battle Pass loot that you get, Clash of Clans has a much bigger part focused on these non-economic rewards. I didn't do the math, but if you play the games, it will be immediately obvious that they give you a lot more of this non-economic value, which is a great way to not have to give you so much permanent progression. And instead, Clash Royale doesn't really have a ton of these perks. They've introduced chest queuing, which is nice, free challenge entries, which is nice, but really there wasn't anything that is game-changing from a quality of life standpoint. And the last point is that they have a lower share of non-economic rewards over total rewards, meaning they're forced to give you more permanent progression. So again, not only it's a smaller economy, it's less scalable, but on top of that, Battle Pass makes the faucet, makes the bucket empty sooner, basically. Okay, so now let's go into each one of these. And I've mentioned most of the points, but let's see if there's anything more to add. Depth of the economy, Clash Royale basically, like I said before, the collection is kind of skill capped. Most players play with 1 or 2 decks at most. Each card requires months to master, right? By itself, and the synergies with the cards, with other cards in your deck. And that basically means that if a card doesn't fit in your deck, you may want to keep, you may want to get it anyway, because at some point you may want to switch and try new decks, but it's less of a compelling need. Also, because the progression in Clash Royale is defined by the PvP ladder, and mastering a deck is punishingly hard, the fear of losing trophies is real. So once your collection is high enough on those 8 cards, you really think about it twice before you actually, let's try this new deck. Every time I've tried it, basically I've dropped hundreds of trophies and said, okay, this is great, but maybe not. Weak incentives to strengthen collection. I mentioned this before. Basically, leveling up a card in Clash Royale feels great at the beginning because of how cheap and from a number of copies of the card and gold required. But then it becomes progressively harder and harder. And Aina Joas talks about this in his Clash of Clans presentation, where he says that clans had a similar problem and they flattened the curve out a little bit, because basically when the ROI decreases too much for players, it becomes discouraging. And so Clash Royale has a very steep and very punishing curve after a few levels. From level 12 to level 13, the number of copies you need for a common is basically more than every other level combined, which is insane if you think about it. Second point is that non-PvP game modes didn't really provide strong incentives to go broad. We talked about how Clan Wars, for some reason, wasn't as effective in Clash Royale, whereas it is the keystone driver of players' engagement in Clash of Clans. So the same thing was with the touchdown and other game modes. And then the last point here is that Clash Royale, because it's a very pure game, if you will, allows players to play many competitions at tournament standard, meaning tournament standard is reachable with really a couple of months of grinding and basically no money spent. And so, having maxed out cards doesn't really matter for a variety of the competitions. So that puts a bit of a strain on going deep as well. And then last point here, the economy has been deflating since the very, very start. I remember very well when they replaced the chests in the store. I think it was December 2017. If you guys remember back then, the best way to get a legendary was to buy a super magical chest, which cost $30 and had a 40% chance in the top arena to give you a legendary. That was replaced with a better chest that had 100% drop rate of a legendary. And this was done effectively throughout every single chest. On top of that, they've had more frequent sales. There's a sale all the time now. Very generous events like Gold Rush, and also trade tokens. Basically, the ability to acquire a legendary now, the legendary that you want, is much higher with trading tokens. That basically disrupted the need to go buy legendaries in the shop at 40,000 gold when they're available. And again, I think I'm not criticizing being generous with players. I'm just saying, again, it's a physics problem. If your bucket is smaller and it doesn't scale as much, well, you have to be careful with this because it can hurt you. Okay, depth of the economy for Clash of Clans. Basically, we mentioned it before. Progression here is not only tied to attacking. You want to level up everything in your base, all the buildings. It's meaningful to every player. Everybody wants heroes. These are common to every attack strategy, basically. And then one more, a little bit nerdier point, if you will. Clans has way fewer troops than Clash Royale. Clash Royale has almost 100 cards by now, and you pick the 8 to 16 that you need, and that's basically it. Whereas Clash of Clans has maybe 20 troops total or less, and most of the troops or most of the army compositions are similar in terms of the units that you need. Meaning when you have fewer units, but everybody needs them, it's easier to want to level them all up, as opposed to, in Clash Royale, I'm never going to use mirrors, so I'm not going to be spending the resources to upgrade it. Whereas Giants, even if I play mostly with air, I do want to upgrade Giants because I know I will use them at some point. Social incentive to progress, we discussed this. Basically, Clan War Leagues is the ultimate progression driver in Clash of Clans, and incentivizes every player to level up as much as they can. If you look again at the presentation from Aino on Clash of Clans, there's one, again, this is a pretty nerdier point, there was one change that the Clash of Clans team made 2 years ago that had a major impact on the economy and on the desire of players to progress. Clash of Clans at some point had a matchmaking algorithm that was designed based on war weight. And so players didn't have the incentive to level up everything in their bases because you wanted to have the lowest war weight to be able to be matched against a player with low war weight as well. And so, you were taking all the resources that you were gathering and pouring them into walls, or at least I did that for 2 years. And it was all about maximizing your punch power and minimizing your war weight. By changing this little element and introducing Clan War Leagues where you're incentivized to invest in your base as much as you can, as much as you want, that basically created a desire for players to invest in everything. And so that was major before Battle Pass was introduced. Okay, scalability of the economy. So we talked about how in Clash Royale, all cards are capped at level 13, and that cap never grows. And by the way, it will never grow even now because they've added vanity for the cards on top of that. So even if they wanted to, they would have to overhaul the whole vanity system tied to cards. Each new card is a little bit limited in its impact by design because there are no straight upgrades, and the design space is getting a little bit narrower. Like I said, once you design Zap and Log, maybe if you're a genius, you can come up with Tornado that was very effective at being a cheap spell that has a unique purpose, but how many more of these can they reasonably create in a way that is meaningful for players, changes the actual meta without overpowering the cards that they have? It's really hard. And so, as you may have noticed, if you look at the number of new cards that they've released over time, at the very beginning it was fast, and now they slowed it down because there really is limited design space. And even I would love to take a look at their data and understand the adoption rate of some of the new cards. And then, like we said before, there's basically little else to spend on. Some emotes and tower skins are covered in the non-economic reward section, but there really isn't much else to spend. Scalability of the economy on clans. I think this is the single most brilliant move from Clash of Clans. They've been able to create an economy with a moving goalpost. Everything scales up and gains a level on a regular basis. And the true masterpiece here is that they've been able to do this in a way that players look forward to. So basically, the folks in my clans and I are rejoicing every time there are 5 more levels to the Archer Queen. It's awesome because you have more to chase. So with fewer units and fewer things to work on, they've created this perfect conveyor belt where you always want to sink resources into these units. And on top of that, they also have, so this has created a very strong economy that has offset the slower introduction of new heroes, buildings, and troops and spells. The one thing I would like to say about clans that is not perfect is that they have not been able to introduce a lot more new heroes, buildings, troops, and spells. But this is offset by the fact that their existing economy is so strong, and this moving goalpost is enough to offset that. Consumables, we mentioned these before. Effectively, what consumables represent is they present a meaningful chase item for players, for everything, for events, for offers, for monetization levers such as Battle Pass. And what they do is they eliminate major pain points. For example, it could have taken 2 weeks to upgrade something, and now you have, well, 14 days. Can go to 0. And or they can offer great rewards that you can fill up your Dark Elixir gauge or something like that. And the beauty of these consumables is that they can be easily drained from the economy. There's also a cap in your inventory. And so, you get them, you use them, and then you want them again, which is awesome. Let's look at the non-economic rewards. So there's specific ones tied to Battle Pass only. So I divided this into 3 parts: vanity, perks, and overall weight. Vanity, I think the first point is common to both. Both games have quite a reasonable amount of vanity in terms of 1 hero skin for Clash of Clans per Battle Pass, 1 tower skin, and emotes for Clash Royale. They seem very similar. They both do a decent job at coming up with something that sounds exciting for players, or for some players. Although Clash Royale allows you to access vanity also outside of Battle Pass, because like we said, when you max out a card, you can begin to add vanity effects to it. However, I'm not quite sure how critical vanity is for these two games. I think there's definitely a part of the player base that cares about them, but Clash of Clans and Clash Royale have been very strong without vanity, and I would love to be able to see, if it were possible, how many players truly care about this. My sense is that in Clash of Clans, the majority of people that I know are happy to collect the skin at the very end, but that's not why they buy the Battle Pass. It's because of all the economic and non-economic rewards and the perks above all that they get. Perks. Clash Royale, again, has some, but not as many. Clash of Clans has a lot more. I think these are not only more in terms of volume, but they're very meaningful quality of life changes and upgrades. Again, the 1 gem donation for me is worth buying the Battle Pass, even if I don't finish it. There are massive discounts to basically research and upgrade time, upgrade cost, and those are very, very valuable. And then there's also a bank, similarly as Clash Royale. One thing also is that we haven't really talked about UI here, but I wanted to call out that the Clash of Clans UI is very powerful in showcasing all the different types of rewards that you get. And again, they do a lot of emphasis on these perks and on the quality of life, and not just focus on the economic value that they give you. And then lastly, I didn't do the math here to prove my point, but trust me, this is true. The amount of value that you can get in terms of non-economic rewards, the amount of share, the share of non-economic rewards in Clash of Clans is bigger over total compared to Clash Royale, because they just don't have a lot more to give you. And so, like I said, that makes Battle Pass much better sustained within the Clash of Clans economy compared to Clash Royale. One more point I wanted to call out. This is an open question. I'm not saying this is true, but I think Clash Royale may have done a damage to its game by uncapping sessions. So one of the quote unquote perks, or actually it's not even a perk, because this is accessible by every player, both those who have Battle Pass and those who don't have Battle Pass on Clash Royale. With the introduction of Battle Pass, Clash Royale has overhauled how Crown Chest works. So basically, Clash Royale used to manage player sessions with Crown Chest, that is that thing on the top right corner that basically refresh every 24 hours and has a pretty good chance of giving you great cards, and with the 4 chest slots and the unlocking time of those guys. And Battle Pass partially uncapped these sessions by removing the 24-hour cooldown and letting players to basically binge play. So sure, you do lose some value in binge playing because you still have those 4 chest slots that hasn't gone away. But I found myself and other players that I know basically just going for it, because the crown chest is so good and can give you a lot of value. And I think a game like Clash Royale could see burnout and or potential medium-term losing interest in the game because you have these massive sessions now. And I think, by the way, one of the things that Battle Pass is supposed to do is driving this regularity where players come back every day. By uncapping sessions, you basically undo that. And so, I don't know it for sure. I would love to look at the data and see, but I think there are potential negative downsides for Clash Royale in the medium term by uncapping these sessions. Okay, so basically stepping back a little bit and summarizing all that we have talked about, Battle Pass is a great tool to drive monetization, in particular conversion, and I think it can be even better at driving regularity, retention, session length, and engagement with specific game modes. It can be very, very strong. I think Battle Pass is not a silver bullet for all games. It's a bit of a dangerous herd mentality in the industry, where everybody sees something working and they think, oh, it worked for game XYZ, but it's going to work for mine too. Well, not really. You have to have, like we said before, enough stuff that players want. The economy has to be deep, has to be scalable, and you have to have enough meaningful non-economic rewards, because otherwise, if your game is like Clash Royale, where again, the economy is somewhat smaller than Clash of Clans, it's not scalable, and you've been devaluing it over time, well, Battle Pass, all that it does, it basically accelerates that depleting of that water bucket that I mentioned before. Third point here is that non-economic rewards such as vanity and perks can be very valuable to limit the impact on IAPs, and Clans does a great job there. The fourth point, we didn't really talk very much about it, but I think it's worth calling out anyway. Basically, especially for games that have a lot of focus on vanity items, implementing and operationalizing Battle Pass requires scaling up your live ops efforts to produce and maintain an amazing content pipeline. Think about all of the deals that Fortnite has made with the Marvel and all that, and producing a pipeline of these skins can be really expensive, and keeping your shop and your Battle Pass exciting and sexy over time requires bulking up of the team and of the focus on it. And lastly, be careful of design pitfalls, because there could be things that are working well, for example, sessioning in Clash Royale, and you don't want Battle Pass to break what's actually working. Okay, so with that, I will pause and open it up for questions.